Hello there and welcome to the Q&A show, live and interactive. Revelation TV has received many emails and contact from viewers asking us for a special guest to talk about the Covid-19 vaccine. I'm pleased to say tonight we are joined by Professor David Back, Professor of Pharmacology at the University of Liverpool, and is part of the COVID vaccine trial. Professor David was a member of the Medical Research Council for AIDS and Therapeutic Trial Committee. He was a member of the World Health Organization Experts Group on Contraception and Malaria. He was organising the committee of numerous HIV meetings. David planned to ease up work and then COVID came. He is now working on potential drug treatments for COVID and is part of the Oxford vaccine trial. He is married to his wife Angela for 50 years and has 3 children and 11 grandchildren. He has now been involved in a church leadership for 40 years in Liverpool, where he's helping struggling pastorless congregation. Tonight we'll be talking about the COVID vaccine, and where up until today, 6.3 million people in Britain have so far received their first dose. 2.3 jabs over the past week. 493,013 jabs on Saturday, and 469,660 have had 2 doses so far. Professor David Back, Professor of Pharmacology, thanks so much for joining us. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you, Cyrus. It's great to be with you, and I just hope that we can allay maybe some fears and have some discussion which will be helpful to our viewers tonight. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I just want to remind our viewers, this program is all about the viewers, your questions and your interaction. So please do send us an email. live@revelationtv.com is the email address. SMS details will be on screen. Now, Professor David, you've already prepared a presentation for us for tonight as well, haven't you? Which you've shared online. And I think Let's start with this, because this will be some good background information for our viewers to know, okay? So this is the first piece of information that we have here. Do you want to just talk us through what we see?
So thanks very much, Cyrus. I think it's important for us to recognize there are different types of vaccine. And so with COVID-19, there are 3 different types, which you may have heard and the viewers may have heard referred to. The first is nucleic acid or RNA vaccines. And the first one to be approved in the UK was the BioNTech Pfizer vaccine, which is an RNA vaccine. And then the third one to be authorized was the Moderna vaccine, again, an RNA vaccine. And then we come down to viral vector vaccines. We'll explain these terms a little bit as we go along. And the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine is an example of a viral vector vaccine that has been approved. And then following along behind that, there are 2 other from Janssen and Merck, which are also viral vector vaccines. The third type are protein subunit. We're not going to talk about those tonight. They've not been approved, but they are in the pipeline and we might hear about them within a few months. So maybe if we go to the next slide, and we can think a little bit more about some of the details of the 3 approved vaccines in the United Kingdom. So the Pfizer BioNTech, it's an RNA vaccine. It's given in 2 doses. Originally, the trial data was on 2 doses, 3 or 4 weeks apart, although now there has been the move to have 12 weeks difference in timing between the first and the second dose. And maybe we can discuss that later. It's effective, 95% effective. The downside is the storage at low temperature, -70 degrees, and a relatively high cost per shot of £15. The Moderna vaccine is also an RNA vaccine. We'll talk about what that means. 2 doses, similar effectiveness to the Pfizer BioNTech, not quite as stringent storage conditions, slightly less temperature, still low temperature. It's above a normal fridge. The cost, again, high, £25 a shot. And then finally, the Oxford University AstraZeneca, it's a viral vector, 2 shots. Different effectiveness rates have been cited, so between 62% and 90%, although the more recent data does suggest it is in the upper band towards 90%. And the advantage is it can be kept in the fridge. So in the GP's surgery, for example, a fridge, and the cost is very much lower at £3 for each shot. So that's the broad brushstroke. Maybe we should go into just a little bit more detail. So if we looked at the next slide, which we've prepared, to talk about what do we mean by an RNA vaccine. So the Pfizer-BioNTech, which some of our viewers may have had, and Moderna, in this case, the scientists have taken a part of the virus's genetic code, or the genetic information in the RNA, and have turned that into a vaccine. And they've done that by having a fat or a lipid membrane around this small piece of message, the messenger RNA. And once that's injected into an individual, what it does is to tell certain cells to make a protein. And the protein is the spike protein of the COVID virus. So the RNA has come, or it's been synthesized and made to be able to produce the protein of the COVID virus, which you all see when you look at any television screen, you see these spikes. That is the protein that is made. So if you look at that summary at the bottom, this small fragment of material, it's very small, it's 30 micrograms or 0.03 of a milligram. Now think about when you take a paracetamol, it's 500 milligrams. This is a tiny, tiny fraction of material. And that is into this lipid, this fat membrane, and it's injected into us when we have the vaccine. So that's the basis. If we look at the next slide, what happens when that is injected is that it produces the antibodies. So now the message has told cells to get this spike protein made. That in turn generates antibodies. So the body's immune system reacts to produce antibodies. The cells which house the mRNA and started to produce the protein, those cells will die very quickly. So that mRNA doesn't stay around in the cell, doesn't get into DNA, and those cells will die. But you have now the antibodies, and the antibodies can fight the disease if you are infected with COVID. So that's the way the mRNA vaccines work. Maybe we should turn now to the second class of vaccines, which is the AstraZeneca vaccine. And we've prepared a slide how this vaccine works. It's a little different. So scientists in this case have taken the genetic information or the genes for the spike protein, which is on the surface of coronavirus, but they've put that message into a harmless, different virus. In this case, the harmless virus has come from an animal, and it's an adenovirus or a cold-producing virus, which is basically inactivated. It's a very weakened version of this live virus, which now contains the message to make the spike protein of the COVID virus. So that is injected, and once it's injected, you then produce the antibodies in the same way. So the summary at the bottom reminding us that it contains a weakened version of a different, not a COVID virus, this is a cold-producing virus, which has been greatly attenuated so that it can't give an individual, can't give us a cold, but it does supply the information to make the antibodies. So here we have the basis of how the AZ Oxford vaccine works. If we looked at the next of our pictures, the next of our slides, what it shows us is that if you, for example, went to a vaccine station and the nurse comes out with a bottle, you might see the words CHADOX1 for the Oxford vaccine. And so this is the vaccine, which is from the attenuated virus. CH actually means chimpanzee. So the adenovirus has been derived from an animal. The AD means the adenovirus, and the OX means Oxford. So don't get frightened by that. That is simply what those letters mean from the Oxford vaccine. So I hope that that just gives a broad brushstroke. I'm sure there are many questions, but it gives us a broad brushstroke of the two main types of vaccines that we have against COVID virus in the United Kingdom. Maybe there's a couple of other things we should say before we take. I'm sure there'll be many questions, but there's one other slide, I think, or two other slides that maybe it would be worth going through with our viewers, so that we can see some of the issues. Now, normally the vaccine development of different vaccines, and of course we've had many different vaccines over the years. Vaccination has been very important: diphtheria, smallpox, MMR, mumps, measles, rubella, for example. And traditional vaccine development does and has taken quite a long time. So the discovery process and determining what kind of a dose you need could take anything from 3 to 8 years. The clinical trials could take 2 to 10 years. And then going through all the review process, at least a year. So you're talking potentially about 5 to 10 or more years for normal vaccine development. With the COVID vaccines, if you look at that bottom line of the development process to the end on the right-hand side, we've had 3 approved by the MHRA, our medicines regulator in the UK. And there are others in the pipeline behind. In fact, there's more than 100 other vaccines which are in some sort of development process. But everything has been very rapid because so many people have been working on this in academia, in pharmaceutical companies, and in public health institutions. For example, in my own university, the only research that you could do in the last year in the whole of the medical and scientific faculty has been on COVID. So everybody has just dropped tools and worked on COVID. So the whole process has been really a fast process. And I think it's important to note that. And then maybe there's one other thing we could say, which is on the next of the slides, which is people have asked, well, what is the attitude to COVID-19 vaccines? And it's a really good question. Is everyone in agreement with it? Well, the answer is, well, there's some degree of range of opinions. So in an online survey in October 2020, nearly 20,000 people were asked in different parts of the world, if a vaccine for COVID-19 were available, would you get it? And if you just look, it's a complex figure, but at the top, the total in the blue and the orange is 73%. The blue is people who said, yes, yes, we want the vaccine. The orange or the red are those people who said yes, enthusiastically. The green are those who were not sure. And the yellow said adamantly, no, they would not take a vaccine. So in the total survey, 73% said yes. 27% were not sure or said no. And if you just scan down to about the 6th line, in the United Kingdom, it was 79% who said yes and 21% who said no. So maybe this gives some context. There are people who are saying no, and maybe some of our viewers will be saying no. And I just hope that we can allay some of the fears and some of the questions which people have, and just try to be honest about where we are with the vaccines.
Professor David, now more importantly, before we go on, do I call you Professor David? David, what would you like me to call you?
David, absolutely David.
All right, David, thank you so much for that fantastic presentation. We've already had all the emails have already started coming in, so we're going to start going through them. This one's from Michael in the Republic of Ireland. He's saying, good evening. I just want to ask a simple question. I understand that the recovery rate of this so-called pandemic is 99.5%. So the following question is, why has there been no advice on boosting immune systems with vitamin C, D and zinc plus selenium and magnesium since the whole thing has started?
Well, it's a good question, and one I think which does have some important aspects in the sense that we should try to boost our immune system. And there are things that we can have which will boost the immune system. But even if you were taking the whole list that Michael stated, then you would not have enough boosting of your immune system in any way to fight off, because you're not specifically making the antibodies which are necessary to fight against the COVID virus. And just another point, Michael mentioned this figure of 99 point something percent. I would point out that, for example, in England, we've had 3.5 million cases of COVID and reached 100,000 deaths, which means that the percentage of deaths to the actual number of COVID infections is nearly 3%. It's about 2.8%. And if you look at different age groups, of course, the over 80s and the over 70s, the death rate is very much higher. So I do think there are a couple of issues there raised by Michael, important. We should try to boost our immune system, absolutely. But I do think we should be realistic that this is a deadly virus and we are seeing a very high death rate. So it's something that we should really bear in mind.
Okay, the next email here's coming from Veronica. She's saying, "Hi, brothers Cyrus and David. Thank you for your time. My question is, of all the vaccines available, I heard the Oxford is the deadliest of all of them, and it is the one that does contain the fetus of aborted babies. Why should we trust the vaccine, and how do we know it's meant for good for the minorities and it's not an attempt to eradicate us, and have done with the abortion law, with the directing of the reducing of births of Black African Americans? And we know from research that over 60 million alone aborted babies in America history belong to the African Americans. Since when we have started prioritising us blacks, and it seems to us that the minorities are just the guinea pigs." What are your thoughts?
Well, I think there were probably 5 questions in one there, Cyrus. But maybe we should deal with the issue of the fetal material. And this is an issue which I think is important for many, many of us, and it's something that does need clarification. So some cells used in vaccine development are cells which are grown in the laboratory, and they were originally developed from tissue from an abortion in 1973. Now, this is not peculiar just to the COVID vaccine. Many vaccines have used these particular types of cells. The cells which have been used in development of both the RNA and the vector vaccine are cells from an abortion in 1973. Now, I'm sure many of us would wish that an abortion had not taken place, and that cells that were extracted or taken from the kidney of a fetus in 1973 had not been used. I think that many people would say that. But I really would point out that those cells have been taken and they've been transformed, or they've been cloned or reproduced over the past 47 years, so that any cells used today are a very distant, very, very distant, in a sense, relation to the original cells that were taken from that aborted baby fetus in 1973. So that it is true that the cells are used. Now, how are they used? Okay, so this is really important. They're used in a different way. So in the Pfizer, BioNTech and Moderna vaccines, the cells, these HEK293 cells, are used in one step, and that is to confirm that the mRNA is making the protein. So it's a very small step in the vaccine development. There is absolutely no fetal material whatsoever present in the vaccine. These cells were just used, these distant relative cells were just used in order to see whether the mRNA was producing the protein. Now, the AstraZeneca, and the question said the AstraZeneca vaccine is more deadly. The AstraZeneca vaccine, because it's a vector vaccine, viruses will only grow if they have human cells or animal cells to grow in. So we either have to use animal cells or human cells. And these cells derived from the fetus are actually used as miniature factories in order to get the adenovirus, which is what the vector is for the Oxford vaccine. So yes, that is true that is happening, but please bear in mind that the cells used today are a very, very distant relative back to 1973. And there are no fetal cells that have been taken in the last number of years which have anything to do with vaccine development. It is simply that these cells grow very well and can produce the vaccine very quickly. And there are a number of things we could say I could develop on that in terms of why I do think that we can argue from a number of perspectives and from the Bible about this particular issue, but maybe we should come back to that, or unless you want me to continue a little bit on that theme.
Yes, please do continue, because you did have some final thoughts on your presentation, didn't you? I wonder if our guys can put up slide 9 for us, because I think that'll be particularly important for our viewers.
Okay, I mean, I think we do have to give thanks to God for the scientific and medical knowledge that we have and the expertise to develop the vaccines, which have been done very, very rapidly. And if I can make the particular point in the second line here about vaccination being a way to protect the most vulnerable, remembering that James in James 1 says we should look after those in distress, and clearly many people are in distress, being isolated, not being able to see their grandchildren, not being able to meet a friend for a coffee, etc., etc. People are in distress. And so for me, vaccination is a way out of meeting that particular issue. I would add some other points, actually, Cyrus, which if I can, I think this is a moral debate.
Yeah.
And one can use the greater good argument, for example, that the greater good has come saving thousands of lives or even tens of thousands of lives out of something, yes, that maybe we wish hadn't happened, which was that original abortion. But Christians face moral dilemmas all the time. And I would suggest that many viewers face the dilemma, which, for example, if they have a pension, their pension could be invested in areas of the whole society that they wish it wasn't invested in. So how do we know where our pensions are invested? Or, I live in a city, Liverpool, where there are many houses that were built on the back of the slave trade. And people now live in flats and houses which originally were built on the slave trade.
Yeah.
Now, that's potentially a moral dilemma. We could wish that hadn't happened. And so you can go through this. I enjoy music. But some of the classical composers and some of the modern composers, their lifestyle, potentially, I wouldn't agree with from a moral perspective at all.
Yeah.
And therefore, we face these moral dilemmas, and we have to come to some realistic understanding that sometimes what may have been evil, actually, you could say, did God mean this for good? Go back to Genesis 50, where Joseph, having been put into the pit, sent into Egypt, ended up in a prison cell. God raises him up, becomes second in command in the land. When he meets his brothers, he says to them, you meant that for evil. God meant it for good. And maybe there's just a way that we could look at that with the vaccine as well, that God is meaning this for good.
Thank you, David. David, we've got so many emails and we're just going to go through them, okay? So here's another one here from Sandra saying,
Sure.
Evening, can you please tell me why the younger you are, the stronger the side effect of the AstraZeneca vaccine? Asking this as from a known person who has had it. There's many thanks from Sandra.
So I was one of the first over 70s to be recruited into the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine trial. And I had absolutely no side effects at all, a tiny little bit of redness on the arm, but absolutely no side effects. And I have heard of people who have had side effects. I had somebody phone me, in fact, just a couple of days ago, having side effects, which were they felt a headache and a little bit nauseous. So there are in some individuals some side effects which are normally very transient, but very similar to the flu vaccine, for example. Some of the serious side effects which have been highlighted are extremely rare. I was looking at statistics today, and there have been 8 cases out of 4.5 million doses of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine of what is termed allergic reaction, which did require some degree of intervention. So 8 out of 4.5 million doses of the vaccine. So the other thing to remember, Cyrus, is that, I've worked in drugs. I'm a pharmacologist. I work in drugs. There's no such thing as an absolutely safe medicine. I could take an aspirin now and put it on my gum and get an ulcer because aspirin can cause ulcers. And paracetamol, which people take. Paracetamol, if you take too many, can cause liver damage.
Yeah.
So it's always a risk-benefit safety profile.
Okay.
And that's going to be the same with the vaccines.
There's a text message coming saying, how was the vaccine approved so quickly? Has any other vaccine been produced so quickly in the past?
It's a great question, and it's a really important question, which I briefly touched on in terms of the speed of development. I think with the mRNA vaccine, which is a new methodology, which is the Pfizer-BioNTech and Moderna vaccines, they had done a lot of preliminary work looking for vaccines for other diseases such as Ebola and Zika, for example. And so there had been a lot of work on mRNA, and this was beginning to pay dividends for our understanding. So when COVID came along, we could hit the ground running. But there have been so many people put into the field to develop the vaccines. It's just been an unprecedented number of people because we're in a pandemic situation. I don't think corners have been cut in terms of safety. I know the regulators at the MHRA. I know them personally. I do think they're this is the authorization team. I do think they've reviewed the data extremely thoroughly. So I don't have any fears about the way that things have been done. It has been done rapidly, absolutely, but it's been done rapidly because of an unprecedented effort by so many people in so many different groupings.
Okay, the next question here is, has the testing trial period for the vaccine followed normal recommendations for the trialing of vaccines?
Again, it's in a sense that question runs into the previous question for the timing. And I think if you compared it with the timing of previous vaccines, then this has been very, very much quicker, and things have been curtailed into, or they've been truncated into a much shorter period of time.
Okay.
But, one can look at the situation and say, this is the first pandemic, global pandemic that we've been in our lifetime. We've needed to do something which is different, and we've done that.
Okay, the next text message is coming saying, Dear Cyrus, can the professor please explain what can be done for us who have had the first vaccine, but they cancelled the appointment for the second vaccine? My husband had the first vaccine 5 weeks ago, and he's still waiting for an appointment for the second. Please tell us, what can we do?
So I think this is where there's a little bit of debate, because both of the vaccines, or the vaccines that we have, were trialed on a second dose being given 3 to 4 weeks after the first dose. And that is where we have the bulk of the data to show the effectiveness, where we have the 2 doses 3 or 4 weeks apart. To some extent, it's been, in my view, a political decision merged into the medicine to say we need to vaccinate more people and therefore will spread the doses to 12 weeks in order to vaccinate twice as many people with one dose and get some degree of immunity at least. Now, most of the immunity does come from the first dose. If I was honest, I would prefer that we had a maximum of 6 weeks between the first and the second dose, because the data to me supports that better than, say, 12 weeks. So that was my own personal opinion. So the viewer who asked about 5 weeks, I would like to see that 6 weeks. And in fact, the BMA in the UK, the British Medical Association, have asked that we reduce the 12 weeks down to 6 weeks. And I hope that maybe a difference, that change may come.
Okay, so Tidden's written in to say, greetings to you both. How safe is the vaccine for people with autoimmune disease?
So that's a great question as well. And one that, because in the trials, there were not examples of some specific diseases and people were excluded, and there are some issues that I think we need further answers on. At the moment, the vaccines are given to anyone. So even someone who, for example, is immunosuppressed, who's on cancer chemotherapy, immunosuppressed, and someone with autoimmune disease, such as arthritis and other things, then at the moment we're saying we do need to give the vaccine. So that is not, it is not a condition which would preclude having the vaccine under those circumstances. The only real reason not to think about the vaccine is if one's had a really severe anaphylactic, bad allergic response to a previous vaccine, and then that has to be discussed with the healthcare professionals as to how one proceeds. But at the moment, there are very few restrictions at all in anyone. The greater problem is actually getting COVID.
Yeah.
That is the greatest problem at the moment, having COVID, and the unknown, because, as we've said, many people are dying from COVID at the present time.
Okay. Pam and Tony has written in, say, good evening, Cyrus and Dr. Back. Is it possible to choose which vaccine we have? We really do not want the Pfizer one and would prefer the Oxford one. I've heard the Oxford one is the best. Is it true that these vaccines have a tracer that you can be traced through something into the vaccination, and that these vaccines can also alter your DNA?
So again, there are a number of questions there. Absolutely no, they cannot alter the DNA. Neither the Pfizer-BioNTech or the AstraZeneca in any way get into the DNA. That is impossible. It is just the message making a protein, so nothing affects the DNA. So that is clear. There is no tracer. There's been quite a lot of discussion around the way that potentially you could have a tracer, which you could then follow people. That is not true at all. There is no tracer in the vaccine, so you cannot follow any individual.
Okay.
That is just not true.
Okay, Mike's written in, say, do you know? Do people in which vaccine may not be effective still produce antibodies? And if they do, why doesn't the vaccine work?
Okay, can you just repeat that again? I didn't quite get
Do people on which a vaccine may not be effective still produce antibodies? And if they do, why doesn't the vaccine work?
It's a great question. So the great question is, why are the vaccines not 100% effective? And that is partly to do with the production of the antibodies. And we do need that. Again, we do need some further understanding about that as to whether it's just a matter of the quality of the antibodies or the quantity of the antibodies which are being produced. So I'm not sure that we have a definitive answer on that particular point. It's one that certainly needs to be followed up as to why there may be 10% of people who do not generate the antibodies.
Okay.
Our immune systems are really complex. everyone is different in their immune system. If my wife and I go for a walk, for example, in the summer, and there's little midges or some horsefly or something, she gets bitten, she comes out in huge lumps.
Yeah.
I get bitten, nothing happens.
Okay.
So her immune system is very different to my immune system. And so our understanding of how we generate antibodies is actually quite complex. And so the question which was asked is a really important question to know. How is it that we get 90% effectiveness and 10% don't get effectiveness? And do they need a further dose, for example? So there are many questions yet to answer.
Thank you so much for that. Glenda's written in to say, hi, has there been some information or maybe on malaria tablets being helpful, as they are also a lot cheaper? Why aren't the scientists looking into this? And God bless.
So thanks very much for that question. Well, actually, first interest is drug treatment rather than vaccines. So I've been working right from February last year on drug treatment, and we have a huge effort in our university on looking for drugs. And to date, there have been 180 different drugs which have been trialed or are in trials to see if we can get a drug that would be an antiviral to stop the virus replicating. That if you knew you had COVID, you just took a pill and it would stop the virus replicating and get rid of the virus. Be great. And I think we've all heard of hydroxychloroquine, anti-malarial drug. President Trump took hydroxychloroquine. Oh. In the laboratory, it did have some anti-COVID action. Once it was in people, there was no evidence at all that hydroxychloroquine worked. It had no antiviral activity whatsoever in patients. And there have been many other drugs which have been tried. I've actually got the Times newspaper in England on my desk here. And on Saturday, there was a big article saying wonder drug. And it was a drug called ivermectin, which has been used in the past, would be incredibly cheap. And trials in Bangladesh and in Egypt and in the United Arab Emirates have said in very small trials that ivermectin might work for COVID. Well, it's early days. We'll see. We need bigger trials. There's no real evidence, in my view, that works, but we would need some further data.
Okay, Les.
Yeah, I'd love to see a drug.
Les has written in to say, I heard that South African variant is not affected by the current vaccines. If new variants are not affected by current vaccines, or how much benefit are the vaccines? Some experts may not have enough research and may have done to determine the long-term safety. And if people are receiving different vaccines, what about the increase of the possible side effects? So it's talking about the different variants coming in with the current vaccines.
So again, yeah, so the data, I mean, at the moment, it's the variant which was picked up from the southeast of England, which certainly seems to be more infectious. And the reason it seems to be more infectious is probably because it binds to the cells that in the nasal cavity and in the throat, etc., and can get into cells much quicker. So the spike has been changed a little bit. But the vaccines against that variant and against the South African variant seem to work, from the limited data we have so far, as effectively as against the original, the COVID that we had. So the early data, now that doesn't say that we will not in the future get variants which do suppress the efficacy of our current vaccines. That could easily happen. I do believe that can happen, which is why I think we will have to be aware that COVID is with us for a long time, and probably every year for the coming years, we're going to have a new COVID vaccine. So this isn't just a one-off. This is going to be something that is going to, keep with us for a long time.
Okay, thank you so much for that, David. Another email is saying, I'm very concerned of the side effects and adverse reactions of taking one of the vaccines. What reassurance can be given regarding this?
So, yes, I mean, I think that's a really realistic and important question. I would just, I would just say again that risk and benefit is part and parcel of everything that we do. So every single drug that we take, there is risk and benefit. And the same with vaccines. Now, later tonight, when I go to bed, I will take a blood pressure tablet. And the benefit is it brings my blood pressure down. The risk is that my ankles could swell up because the side effect is can cause swelling of the ankles. That's just one side effect. Now, with the vaccines, there are some side effects that have been seen in the trials, such as pain, nausea, headaches in some people, and the severe side effects in very, very few, which is to have an allergic or an anaphylactic type reaction, which is why when you take the vaccine, they ask you to wait for 15 or 30 minutes to make sure there's no severe reaction, because if you're going to have a severe reaction, it will happen within 5 or 10 minutes. But otherwise, yes, there could be some side effects, some minor side effects. But I say again, the risk of getting COVID, in my view, far outweighs the risk of taking the vaccine.
Okay.
And the risk of COVID is very great.
B's written in to say good evening. Please, I used to have severe reactions when I took the flu vaccine, but I stopped taking the vaccine for some years and I've not experienced any reactions again, not even a cough or a cold. So I'm a bit concerned about the COVID-19 vaccine because I am now on insulin. What do you think about if I have the complications when I take the vaccine while I'm on insulin?
Insulin per se, insulin itself is not a problem. I think the only thing to discuss if there was a severe reaction with the flu vaccine is to know if it was one of the constituents of the flu vaccine, because each of these vaccines have a number of things in them. It's not just, in a sense, the active. There are other things. You've got gelatin and sorbitol and potassium, and so there's also all sorts of things in a vaccine to stabilize it and to make it injectable. So, and that is true for all the vaccines. So I think if there was a severe reaction previously, that is a discussion with a doctor before our friend takes the COVID vaccine. So yes, that would be a discussion.
Okay, hi guys. Do the vaccines contain preservative, thimerosal and mercury based? There are schools of thought that say that the body does retain the mercury and damages the body. What are your thoughts on this? And God bless.
Thank you. So there are, in some of the vaccines, and I don't know all the details, but in some of the vaccines, there is a trace of thimerosal, which is a mercury, as a stabilizing kind of, but it's a real very, very small trace of the thimerosal. And in thimerosal, the mercury is a very small part of the thimerosal as well. So it's, yes, there may be a trace. Because you need the kind of preservatives and there's some antibiotic that might be in the process of developing the vaccine as well. So there has to be some understanding that within the bottle that you see when you go to get your vaccine, there are a number of different things in there, but they've been tested. They have been tested, and I would sort of urge not to focus on how harmful that is, but to say the balance is how beneficial it is rather than the potential harm. I understand we should ask these questions, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's why we have a committee on safety of medicines, for example, to examine the safety of our medicines.
Okay, this one's saying, I'm not afraid of the vaccine. I live in Scotland and a healthy person between the ages of 20 and 65 in Scotland has 0.016% chance of dying from COVID. And the statistics is correct because I've analysed the Scottish government data to calculate it, and it's easily provable. Why should I take the vaccine when I'm virtually no chance of dying from the virus?
Because there's another thing as well. Not only, it's not just that, the numbers often with statistics, we can prove anything. So we have to be careful about numbers. And I understand the kind of statistics that are being quoted. But for example, there are members of my family. I have two members of my family who both had COVID and then generated long COVID. So two members of my family who are only in their 40s had it in the first round back in May and have had long COVID, which has had implications for various things. So, it may be a very small percentage of younger people who are getting COVID, but also we're thinking that if you have the vaccine, it will protect to some extent against the amount of virus that if you caught COVID, then you could pass it on. So, there are a number of reasons, I think, why we should be very careful about just saying, because it's a very small percentage of the 20s or the 30s or teenagers, that is not a reason. I think what we've seen, for example, in our city here in Liverpool is, the numbers came down to about 1 in 40 people had COVID. Yes, mainly older people, but some younger people as well.
Okay, this one's come in from Tina saying, God's word says we are uniquely made. Is it not true that both vaccines change DNA structure? Very concerned about this.
And it's a really important question. And I would absolutely highlight that we are uniquely, wonderfully made. I mean, you just read through the scriptures and you see we are God's special creation and the wonder of the human body. And one of the reasons I went into science was to explore the wonder of who we are and how we work. And it is an incredible, privilege to know and to try and understand how we work. But these vaccines do not change DNA at all. And I can categorically try and reinforce that as much as I can, because we're dealing with an mRNA. The message makes a protein. It does not get into the nucleus. Now, that is different. I want to point this out. It is different. I've worked on HIV since the very first patients were diagnosed in this country in 1983. And HIV actually gets into the nucleus of the cell. And one of the reasons we've never been successful to get a vaccine for HIV is because the virus gets into the DNA, into the actual nucleus of the cell, and can alter the DNA. And so that is very, very difficult to get rid of and very hard for a vaccine to work against. But it is different with COVID, and the COVID vaccines do not in any way change DNA categorically.
This one's coming in from Jeanette saying, please could you help advise Christians who believe this vaccine will lead to global mark of the beast? Thank you, from Jeanette.
Yeah, no, so it's back to a question to say that, we're, in some way we're marked. But I would just try and reinforce the point that I made before, that there is no marking, there's no microchip, there is no dye or whatever within the vaccine that is going to be able to mark you out as an individual. That is just not true. So I think we just have to be very careful. One of the things as Christians that we are to do is we are to seek truth. And, the thread about truth in the scriptures, when Jesus said, I am the way, the truth and the life. And we follow a God who cannot lie in scriptures, which we believe is the truth and the word of God, because his word is truth. Then we should seek the truth. And I would really just point out that that is not true. And so let's follow the truth.
OK, global statistics show 97% of COVID victims survive. Does David therefore think that there's been a gross overreaction with all the lockdowns?
No, I don't. I mean, one of the reasons that patients survive is the huge effort by the National Health Service. If you come into the hospital and see the effort that our nurses and our doctors are putting in to do everything they can to save people's lives. And one of the drugs that does work is a drug that colleagues have been working on, a drug called dexamethasone. It's an old drug. It's very cheap. But that really helps people who are on oxygen. It helps to suppress their immune system, which is overactive once they start to develop the later stages of COVID. And so many people are surviving now because of dexamethasone, for example. And the quality of nursing and the quality of the healthcare in our country is absolutely brilliant. And so I would really just point that out as being such a huge factor in why we're seeing people survive.
David, we've got so many emails to go through. We've got less than 5 minutes, so we're going to get through these quite quick. Okay, this next one is, do vaccines spread viruses?
Not at all, because there's no virus in the vaccine. There's absolutely no virus in the vaccine. Apart from in the Oxford vaccine, you have this cold virus, which has been inactivated, so is not going to produce a cold in you. But what it does is to produce the antibodies. So there's no virus in that sense, which we should be concerned about.
Okay, this text message saying, why is there no medicines tested or developed instead of vaccine?
Well, they are being tested. Honestly, the effort to develop medicines is huge. There's a trial in the United Kingdom called Recovery, which has been testing medicines. In my own university in Liverpool, we have what's called a platform trial where we try to test new drugs. And I think there's a very exciting drug called molnupiravir, which is, in my view, the best drug at the moment, and it's going into further tests over the next few months. So I'm very hopeful that within months we could have a drug. What we need is a drug that you could take very quickly. If you have symptoms of COVID, take a drug. It stops the virus replicating. Okay. That's my hope. We're pushing towards that.
There's a couple of emails here all asking the same question. How safe is it for people who have already recovered from COVID to get the vaccine?
That's a great question as well. And the advice at the moment is, even if you've had COVID, is to get the vaccine so that you have further antibodies. So it's what we don't know is from COVID how long the antibody reaction lasts. What we do know more from the vaccine trials is that the antibodies are generated and do last. So you do need to have a vaccine even if you've had COVID.
Florence is saying, can you please confirm the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines are still considered safe?
Yeah, I really do believe they're safe from all the data that I have seen. I've scrutinized the data. It's back, again, risk, benefits, safety versus, absolute safety. Well, there can be some side effects, but overall safe, yes.
Okay, this one says, okay, David, we're coming towards the end of the programme. Still got so many emails. Before we finish, David, I want you to just finish on slide number 10. Slide number 10, if you can. Just read that for our viewers.
Okay. So I think what I've tried to do, and maybe people will disagree with me, and we have to come to our own decision. God has given us a mind. And we've got to think these issues through and, where possible, do our part to see a degree of normality return. I like to quote from a pastor in the US, which I read recently, and he said this: we are to act locally, but to think nationally. So